Have you ever had a moment when you felt like you needed an answer from heaven? Sometimes all we have is a prayer. But does God really listen? Today I'm going to tell you the story of Peter, a boy with unwavering faith who discovered that God answers in a surprising way. Stay with me until the end and see how this story can transform the way you trust in God. Before we continue, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. It helps us bring more inspiring messages to you and many other families. Pedro was only 9 years old, but his heart was bigger than his age. He lived with his mother and 2 brothers in a small town in the countryside, where life was simple but full of challenges. From a very young age, he had learned that God was a loving father, always ready to hear his prayers. Every night before going to bed, Pedro would close his eyes and talk to God as if he were speaking to a close friend. But that week, his prayer would be different. He needed a miracle. Pedro's family was going through a tough time. His mother, Mrs. Joanna, worked hard to put food on the table, but the bills kept piling up. The little they had didn't seem to be enough. And the fear of the future began to hover over the house. Pedro could see the worry on his mother's face even when she tried to smile to hide it. He wanted to help, but what could a 9-year-old boy do? So, he decided to do the only thing he knew: pray. That night, Pedro knelt beside his bed and squeezed his eyes shut. God, I don't know how, but I know you can help us. My mom is sad and I don't want to see her like this. Please, make a miracle. His voice was sincere, without complicated words or rehearsed speeches, just a pure heart speaking to the Creator. He didn't know how God would respond, but he believed that he would listen. Then, when he finished, he took a deep breath and smiled. For Pedro, prayer was already the first step of the miracle. Days went by and apparently nothing had changed. The situation was still difficult, and Pedro began to wonder if God had really heard his prayer. But instead of giving up, he kept his faith. God doesn't forget about us, he would say to himself every morning. Unlike the adults who often doubt when the answer is delayed, Pedro simply waited. He didn't know when or how, but he was sure that God would answer. Little did he know that his prayer was about to be answered in a completely unexpected way. That night, Pedro knelt beside his bed and closed his eyes, certain that God was listening. He didn't use complicated words or make long speeches. He simply opened his heart. God, I know you take care of us. My mom is worried, but I trust in you. Please, help us. His prayer was simple but full of faith. He made no demands, just placed his need in God's hands, believing that an answer would come. The next day, when he told his mother that he had prayed for help, she smiled and ruffled his hair. God always takes care of us, my son, she said, trying to keep hope alive. But Pedro noticed that her smile was mixed with worry. Some people around thought it was nice that he prayed, but deep down, they didn't believe anything would really happen. The world doesn't work like that, Pedro, said a neighbor. You can't expect a miracle to fall from the sky. But he wasn't shaken. Unlike the adults, Pedro had no doubts. He didn't try to imagine how God would respond. He simply trusted that he would. His heart was like that of a child eagerly waiting for a gift from their father, without questioning if it would come or not. Even when he heard comments saying it was just a childish dream or that he was being naive, Pedro remained firm. If Jesus said we must have faith like a child, then I'm on the right path, he thought. As the days passed, Pedro continued praying. He didn't see immediate signs of change, but that didn't diminish his confidence. To him, prayer wasn't a desperate request, but a conversation with someone who truly loved him. Every night, before going to bed, he repeated his request, with the same certainty as the first time. There was no hurry, no anxiety, just faith. The people around him might doubt, but Pedro knew that God was listening to his voice. And even though he didn't know how or when, he was certain that the answer would come. What he didn't know was that God was already acting, and the answer would come in a way no one could predict. The days passed, and Pedro continued his routine of prayer. Every night he knelt by his bed and spoke with God, just as he had on the first day. But as much as he waited with a heart full of faith, nothing seemed to change. The problem his family was facing was still there, and the silence of God was beginning to feel too long. He would look up at the starry sky and wonder, did God really hear me? At times, small doubts would arise in his heart. He overheard the adults saying that some things had no solution, that it was necessary to accept reality and move on. But Pedro didn't want to just accept. He believed that God could intervene, and this certainty kept him from giving up. Even when discouragement tried to settle in, something inside him made him persist. If God promised to take care of us, he won't fail, he repeated to himself. There were nights when Pedro felt alone. He prayed, he waited, but the silence continued. He wanted to see an immediate response, something that would show that God was listening, but everything stayed the same. His mother was still worried, and the problems hadn't disappeared. He would take a deep breath and try to remember the Bible stories he loved. Joseph waited years for the fulfillment of the dream God gave him. David fled from Saul for a long time before becoming king. I can wait too, he thought. Even without understanding, Pedro decided to keep praying. He didn't know when God would respond, but he didn't want to be like those who give up halfway. If God was silent, there must have been a reason. So every night he returned to the same place, knelt and spoke to the Lord. I still trust in you, he would say, even when his heart was full of uncertainties. And it was precisely in that time of waiting that something began to change. He didn't know it, but God was already preparing an answer. An answer that would not only solve the problem, but would also show that even in silence, God never stops acting. On an ordinary morning, when Pedro least expected it, something surprising happened. His mother received an unexpected visit. A friend from church, whom she hadn't seen in months, showed up at the door with a smile on her face and a bag full of groceries. She explained that God had placed it on her heart to help Pedro and his family at that moment. For Pedro, it seemed like a clear sign that God was listening to his prayers. The answer, though simple, was exactly what he needed to see God's hand at work. On the same day, something even more astonishing happened. A distant uncle, who lived in another city and whom no one had been in contact with for a long time, called Pedro's house. He was passing through the area and decided to visit. During the conversation, he mentioned that he had just received a promotion at work and wanted to offer financial help to the family. It was as if God had prepared every detail, every move to respond to Pedro's prayer in a surprising way. Pedro looked at the two gifts, his friend's support and the unexpected help from his uncle, and felt peace in his heart. He realized that God didn't need to act the way he imagined. It wasn't a visible miracle, but the way everything unfolded was so perfect that he couldn't deny that God was at work. He didn't need to understand all the details, but he knew the answer came from the Lord, who had heard his prayer and was taking care of him and his family at the right time. In that moment, Pedro learned a valuable lesson. God's answer may come in ways we don't expect, but it always arrives at the right time. He realized that Although he had imagined the solution would come in a miraculous and instant form, God had something even more powerful in mind. Using the people around him in moments that seemed ordinary to show his love and care. Pedro thanked God with a heart full of gratitude. He knew that his faith, though small, had been tested and strengthened throughout this process. God's answer wasn't just about solving a problem, but about trusting in his timing and his way of acting. And even more importantly, he learned that even in moments of silence, God never stopped working on behalf of his family. When Pedro and his family realized God's answer, their emotions were running high. The support from the friend and the unexpected help from the uncle weren't just acts of kindness. They were a clear manifestation of divine care. Pedro's mother, who had been so worried, now had tears of gratitude in her eyes. She hugged her son tightly and said, "You were right, my son. God never abandons us, even in the toughest moments." The miracle wasn't just the solution to a problem. It was the renewal of their trust in God. Gradually, those around them began to notice what had happened. Those who had once doubted Pedro's faith now clearly saw the power of God. The neighbor who had said it was naive to believe in miracles was left speechless when he saw how everything unfolded. He who had been skeptical now began to understand that genuine faith has the power to move mountains. Pedro's story and his simple yet faith-filled prayer spread like wildfire, warming the hearts of everyone around. Soon, people started seeking out Pedro to hear his story. He wasn't a pastor, nor was he famous, just a simple boy who believed in God. But his testimony was impacting more lives than he had ever imagined. "I just believed," Pedro would say with a shy smile. God takes care of all of us, and he answers when we least expect it. Pedro's words touched people deeply, showing that even the simplest faith can bring great results. The impact didn't stop there. Pedro's trust in the power of prayer began to spread through the community. Many people who were going through difficulties started praying more fervently, believing that God could respond in the same way. Others' prayers became more sincere, more confident, knowing that God does not ignore the hearts that seek his help. Pedro, with his simple and steadfast faith, had become a living example of how God can act powerfully and unexpectedly. Pedro's story spread not only through the neighborhood but also within the local churches. He became a symbol of pure, unshakable faith, and many started using his story as an example for their children. Pedro, the boy who prayed with confidence and saw God act, inspired everyone to believe that no matter the age or situation, God always responds when we seek him sincerely. The faith of a simple boy changed many lives and brought hope where there had once only been doubt. Looking at Pedro's journey, it's impossible not to notice the profound lesson that he and his family learned about prayer and trust in God. Throughout the entire process, God was present, hearing every word, even when it seemed like the heavens were silent. Often, in times of uncertainty, it's easy to question what God is doing. But Pedro taught us that true trust is the one that persists, even when we don't see immediate answers. God doesn't forget us. He always listens, even when answers come in ways we don't expect. Pedro's story shows that even when silence seems to be the answer, God is working behind the scenes. The waiting period was hard, and Pedro, like any of us, experienced moments of doubt. However, he never stopped believing. True faith is not the one that gives up in difficulties, but the one that strengthens in the trust that God always has control. His story teaches us that even in the most difficult situations, God has a purpose and acts at the right time, without fail. The central lesson we can learn is that trusting in God doesn't depend on what we see or feel in the moment. Trust is an act of faith that goes beyond the circumstances and challenges we face. Pedro didn't know how, but he believed that God would respond. This trust didn't come from logical certainty, but from an unshakable faith that grew in his heart throughout his journey with God. It's this type of trust that we should cultivate in our own lives, even when things seem difficult or uncertain. Want to invite you who are watching to reflect on your own faith. How have you been praying? Have you trusted God even when answers don't come immediately? Pedro's faith challenges us to be firmer in our prayers and more confident that God is in control, even when the way seems uncertain. God is always near, listening to our prayers, and sometimes the answer may be different than we imagine, but it will always be in His perfect timing. Therefore, I invite you to renew your trust in God. No matter the situation, no matter the difficulty, He is listening and taking care of you. Just like Pedro, you can wait and trust that God will act in the best way, in His time. May Pedro's story inspire your faith, and from today on, may you remember that God never fails to answer the prayers of a sincere heart. What an incredible story, right? Pedro's faith reminds us that even in the toughest moments, God is always listening and acting at the right time. I hope you've been inspired by this journey of trust and prayer. If this message touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you won't miss any of our stories and teachings. May God abundantly bless your life, and may you continue to trust in Him in every moment. I hope to see you in the next video. Stay with God.